Fascinating. So another topic I want to get into is the accusation from atheistic circles that often centers around theists resorting to a God of the gaps argument for phenomena unexplained by science. Interestingly, some atheists appear to embrace the concept of an eternal universe, potentially through the unverifiable notion of a multiverse, to circumvent the implications of the Big Bang, yet dismiss the plausibility of God's eternality. Notably, figures like Richard Dawkins have posited that the complexity observed in DNA suggests an intelligent designer, albeit ascribing it to extraterrestrial origin rather than a divine entity. Could you address this apparent science of the gaps contradiction and share your compelling arguments for theism when confronting atheistic critiques?
All right. There are a number of facets to the question that you've asked. First of all, I think it's very important to understand that the basis for belief in creation out of nothing is not science. It is the Bible. The Bible teaches creatio ex nihilo, and for millennia, Jews and Christians have believed this doctrine wholly apart from modern science. It wasn't until roughly 100 years ago that we had scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. So the basis for the belief in creation out of nothing is biblical teaching, not science. The question for the Bible believer then is this biblical teaching at odds with the deliverances of modern science, or is it in accord with the deliverances of modern science? And here it's indisputable, I think, that the doctrine of creation out of nothing is certainly in accord with modern science. Whether or not it's proved by modern science is irrelevant. The Jew or Christian who comes to the table with his biblical theism firmly in hand is adopting a position concerning the origin of the universe that is right at the center of contemporary cosmogony and astrophysics. There is no discord between the belief in creatio ex nihilo and contemporary science, even if one doesn't regard modern science as a positive proof of creatio ex nihilo. Now, with respect to this idea of a God of the gaps argument, I think it's very important to understand that arguments that appeal to scientific evidence are not using God to be a stopgap to plug up the holes in our scientific understanding of reality. Rather, the proper way to view these arguments is that science can provide evidence in support of a premise in a philosophical argument leading to a conclusion of theological significance. Let me repeat that just to make it clear. Science can provide evidence in support of a premise in a philosophical argument for a conclusion that has theological significance. So, for example, take the Kalam cosmological argument, which has been defended historically by Jews, Muslims, and Christians. This argument is very simple. Premise one is that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. Premise two is that the universe began to exist. And then three, the conclusion is therefore the universe has a cause of its beginning. And you can then do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, and a number of theologically striking properties can be recovered from such an analysis. Now, notice that the second premise of that argument, the universe began to exist, is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. To claim that the scientific evidence supports this premise is not in any way to postulate a God of the gaps. This is a theologically neutral premise, which has, I think, really compelling scientific evidence in its support. So someone who uses the scientific evidence in support of a premise in an argument for theological conclusion is not postulating God of the gaps reasoning, that is to say, using God to stop up the gaps in our scientific knowledge. This argument is based on what we do know about the universe. It is based on what contemporary science does tell us about the past, namely that the universe is in all probability not past eternal, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. Now, you spoke of a kind of science of the gaps that is often used by naturalists in response to arguments of this sort. And I wouldn't characterize that, Ben, as science of the gaps. I don't think this is an opposition between theism and science in any way. Rather, I would characterize it as a naturalism of the gaps. Naturalism is the view that there are no supernatural entities, particularly there is no God, that all that exists is just space-time and its contents. And I think it is a kind of naturalism of the gaps that motivates a lot of these desperate attempts to avoid where the evidence points. And here I think that's evident in that there would be no reason to resist where the evidence is pointing, for example, the beginning of the universe, if it were not for the fact that these naturalists see where that's leading, leads to an unacceptable conclusion, and therefore they have a kind of naturalism of the gaps that whatever caused the universe or whatever the evidence is, somehow the universe is not past eternal, despite the fact that all the evidence points in that direction. And so I would ask them, apart from the presupposition of naturalism, which is to beg the question, why resist where the evidence points? Why not accept where the evidence points, which is that the universe is not past eternal, but had a beginning? Now, in terms of the arguments for theism that one might present, I have presented multiple arguments for theism, only some of which appeal to scientific evidence in support of some of its premises. Let me just list some of these arguments for you. Number one, I think that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists rather than nothing. This version of the cosmological argument doesn't appeal to scientific evidence. Rather, it's a purely philosophical argument that at the basis of all reality, there must be a metaphysically necessary being which is distinct from the universe and supplies a sufficient reason why the universe exists. The second argument would be that God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past. This is the Kalam cosmological argument, to which I've already alluded, and I think it has both philosophical and scientific evidence in support of its key premises. The third argument would be the argument from the uncanny applicability of mathematics to physical phenomena. Why is it that the physical phenomena of this world are describable by elegant mathematical equations that are incomprehensible in their accuracy and so valuable in their utility? This argument from the applicability of mathematics has been defended in our day by the Jewish philosopher Mark Steiner in his book, The Applicability of Mathematics as a Philosophical Problem. Fourth would be that God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for embodied conscious agents like ourselves. The fine-tuning of the universe refers to the fundamental constants and quantities that were simply given in the Big Bang itself that show that the universe is fine-tuned to an exquisite precision for the existence of embodied conscious agents like us against all probability given naturalism. The fifth argument would be that God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and moral duties in the world. Again, this is not a scientific argument, it's a philosophical argument that appeals to our moral experience. We sense that certain things are really right and really wrong, really good and really evil. And the best explanation for the objectivity of the moral values and duties that we grasp are that these are grounded in God, who is the paradigm of moral goodness and whose commands constitute for us our moral obligations. The sixth argument would be that the very possibility of God's existence entails that God exists. This is the famous ontological argument of St. Anselm, and I'm persuaded that a sound and plausible version of the ontological argument can be formulated such that the atheist has to deny not merely that God exists, he has to deny that it's even possible that God exists. So long as God's existence is even possible, the argument shows that that entails that God exists. And then finally, I think that God can be personally known and experienced. This isn't really an argument for God's existence, but it's the claim that wholly apart from arguments, you can know that God exists by having a personal relationship with God. And so for all of these reasons, I think that we have a powerful cumulative case for believing that God exists.